Hello, I'm Roland Ruiz, General Manager for the Edwards Aquifer Authority. When you look at the Edwards Aquifer Authority's mission, it boils down to three words: manage, enhance, and protect. And those three pillars of our mission come to the forefront during drought. We were born out of the necessity to regulate and manage use of the aquifer. But over the past 2 decades, what has happened is we have positioned ourselves not just as the regulator, but as the resource to the region, resource to people who want to better understand their use of water, in particular of the aquifer. So we're here in a kind of a service-minded approach to be of service to the region, to help the region sustain itself during drought, but just as importantly to prepare for those periods of drought. So it's more than just regulation, it's also service through that regulation and trying to help people better regulate themselves so that the EAA itself doesn't have to do that for them. They can do it themselves. And that's kind of what our critical period management plan is predicated on, is regulating at a high level, volumetrically across the region, but requiring and depending upon each individual to do their part. And again, I like to think that the more we educate folks around the region on what it means to be a good steward of this resource, that they will regulate themselves, not because they have to, but because they want to, because they recognize the value in doing so. And once that happens, which we've seen happen across the region, you end up with a greater ethic for sustainability, and you end up with, as our next generation vision says, you end up with a more sustainable aquifer for all users and all uses of the Edwards. You know, drought management is important because we now know so much more than we did, say, a generation or multiple generations ago about the sustainability of our water resources. And with the Edwards Aquifer in particular, we know that it's not a question of the aquifer going dry. What we're managing towards is making sure that the spring flows, the Comal and San Marcos Springs, continue to have spring flow, even in the face of drought. We know that back in the 1950s, the historic drought resulted in the Comal Springs ceasing to flow for about 5 months. That's what we're trying to avoid. And so we're managing really part of the system to ensure that enough water and pressure in the system is there to push water continuously out of those spring systems. So as you look around the country, and you may see droughts affecting people to the west of us in particular, as you go out towards the west coast, you move from semi-arid to arid conditions. And so managing what water supply you have, whatever that natural resource is, whether it's aquifer or whether it's surface water, becomes critically important, because water is life and water is livelihood for all of us. So ensuring that you have enough during the driest times is just critical to the sustenance of our communities and their well-being. I think the importance of managing through drought is being prepared for drought. And fortunately in the Edwards region, we have done a good job, meaning the entire region has come to understand and appreciate and implement a conservation ethic, especially as it relates to the Edwards Aquifer. So we've learned that through experience. We've learned that through past droughts, where we learned the value of water when it's in short supply. The rain comes back and replenishes the aquifer. We don't forget about drought. We begin planning for the next one and being prepared. And I think that's what makes the Edwards region so unique and so well equipped to manage through drought. We know that once we get through this drought, for example, there will be another one in the future. And the work that we're doing now and learning through this drought will help us be better equipped the next time it comes. The Edwards Aquifer Authority's critical period management plan is really our effort to try to help the people that we regulate manage their water use in the most efficient way through a drought. It's a regulatory program that requires certain cutbacks in use of water from the Edwards during the most severe and intense droughts that we experience throughout the region. So critical period management is a way for us to sustain the aquifer at levels sufficient enough to continue to maintain spring flows from the 2 spring systems through droughts. Everything is predicated on a potential repeat of drought of record, the historic drought we experienced in the 1950s. As a regulatory agency, the Edwards Aquifer Authority regulates those entities that use water from the Edwards Aquifer through a permitting system. And that includes not just individuals, but also larger uses like municipalities, industries, and irrigation users. So when we go into a stage of critical period management because of drought, what we're doing is we're imposing on those entities certain restrictions that notifies them and lets them know they need to curtail their use from the aquifer by some incremental amount. And the more that the drought persists, the more that the aquifer levels begin to drop, the more that curtailment that will be required. The difference is that we do not regulate the end user, the citizen, for example, because they more than likely are receiving their water from their local utility provider, whether it be a city or a water utility that they are dependent on for their water. So we don't prescriptively tell the end user, the person that opens a tap at their home, on how to use their water or how much to cut back. We impose the limitations on the water utility. For example, in this region, the biggest utility is the San Antonio water system. So we impose a restriction on SAWS, for example, and they in turn then pass along those restrictions in however they decide to best do it to their end users or their customers. Those practices vary across the region. For example, from city to city, these various utility users and providers may choose to pass that on to their end user in whatever ways they deem most appropriate. Our concern as a regulator is just that the main provider of water from the Edwards is sticking to the curtailment that's required of them during a period of drought. When drought comes, our immediate thought is, what can we do to help sustain, aquifer levels and such? And that's important to be aware of what we can do, for example, around our house, around our businesses. But I will say this, that the best that we can do to manage through a drought is to be prepared for a drought. And that is, for example, in our homes and around our homes, one of the greatest areas of water overusage is outdoors, in our lawns. As we think about drought and we contemplate what happens during drought, our minds generally go to quantity of water in the aquifer. But even during droughts, it's important to remember that quality of the water is equally important. And our mission has kind of turned it towards quality here of late, as we're looking at ways that we can not only protect the quantity of water in the aquifer, but also the quality. Another question that we often get is when are you out of drought? What does it mean to come out of drought? And there's not a real straightforward answer to that, because when in drought, that means that you're having a deficit of rainfall, and the deficit of rainfall, depending on how long it lasts, is going to impact aquifer levels, and that means that you're going to start seeing declines in aquifer level and in spring flows. And so how do we turn the tide, if you will, in drought? Well, it's going to take a lot of rainfall, and it's going to take a sustained period of rain. In other words, going from a dry season to a wet season. And where that rain falls, for example, within the region also matters. So the watershed to the Edwards Aquifer really consists of the larger contributing zone, which is mostly the Texas Hill Country, and then the recharge zone that accepts the water as it flows from the Hill Country down towards the artesian zone. So getting as much water as we can up higher up in the watershed is going to help us get out of drought sooner rather than later. And every bit of rain that does fall, though, does help in the sense that it also helps suppress demand from the aquifer. So as you might imagine, when it's raining, that means people aren't having to irrigate their lawns or their crops, or having to use water in the same way that they would if it's hot and dry. And so again, just a change in weather pattern is what is necessary to break a drought cycle. And here in this part of Texas, as we've become very familiar with, it's generally a flooding type of scenario, unfortunately, that historically has brought us out of drought. So we need to be prepared for all those scenarios and plan accordingly. So if you can prepare your lawn in such a way that you're using drought-tolerant plants and grasses that will hold water longer, it will not only benefit the aquifer, but it'll benefit your bottom line with the money that you have to spend on water rates. So that's one very important thing. In addition to that, there's a lot of just common sense practical things you can do, such as, for example, running full loads of dishes in your dishwashers and also clothes in your washing machines, so you're maximizing the use of that water and not wasting. In addition to that, I think if you can monitor your use and always be mindful of leaks around your property, around your homes, around your businesses, you will be able to prevent water loss. And when it comes time to drought, you will be in a better position to be as efficient with your water use, and it'll help you, again, like I say, with your bottom line and saving you money.